Okay, I think we're ready to go. And as you will no doubt remember, we are in the middle of a rather long lecture series. And I've got good news for you, which is that today we're going to make our way to the 21st century, right? We've spent a fair bit of time in the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. I'm not quite done with the history, but we are close to being done with it. And I definitely want to get us into the contemporary era promptly. And so just to refresh your memories for a moment, the last week we dove deeply into Heather Cox Richardson's analysis of the historical origins and then transformation of the Republican Party, especially drawing on her book To Make Men Free, but also how the South won the Civil War. And we concluded with, and I'm not going to go through all of this with you, but with the idea that after the brief golden moment of the founding of the Republican Party, in which it really did seem to exemplify the ideal of a common good party, especially with its view of the economy as being potentially cooperative and egalitarian and enabling everyone to have sufficient equal opportunity to become an equal citizen, to have equal standing and status and power within your society. And so there's, if you will, a social or economic basis for democratic political equality. And Lincoln's Republicans not only defended the idea of equal opportunity for self-betterment as something that would be good for the society as a whole, economically and politically, they also institutionalized a large number of policies to accomplish that end. However, that did not last. As a matter of fact, it was strikingly short lived. That in certain respects, this aspect of the Lincoln Republicans died with Lincoln in 1865. The remaining aspects of it, which were in a sense uh, revived by Ulysses S. Grant, died with the Compromise of 1877, to be intermittently revived, perhaps by Teddy Roosevelt, as well as by President Eisenhower. But after Lincoln, there is this pull of gravity on the Republican Party coming from the business sector in the United States, especially from New York, but increasingly from the reliance of the Republican Party on highly concentrated wealth and the individuals who control it to fund its operation. And I suggested to you that we might draw two lessons then from the rapid collapse of the Republican Party as a common good party, and then the intermittent oscillations, but the seeming irresistible pull of corporate money in dictating the policy positions of the Republican Party over most of its history. One of them, one of the lessons we can draw is the law of unintended consequences. And this is that you often achieve what you aim to achieve in politics. I shouldn't say that you often do that, but when you do that, there's often the risk that what you have achieved will have consequences that you have not foreseen that will ultimately change the effect you were hoping to produce. And so in the case of Lincoln's Republicans, building the railroads, modernizing the American monetary and banking system, creating a economy capable of prevailing in the Civil War, all of this gave rise to industrialism. And in many respects, the economic philosophy of the early Republican Party was tied to the idea of an agrarian economy, not an industrial economy. And so the Republicans did not anticipate and did not counteract the incredible concentration of wealth that the Industrial Revolution produced, in at least not until Teddy Roosevelt and progressivism and trust busting, right? And by then, it was very difficult to counteract. And in many ways, industrialization had replaced slave power, replaced the slave oligarchy with a new aristocracy of industry. The second, I think, big lesson here, and it's directly related to the first, is the lesson of the tendency to elite capture in political parties. And so political parties are expensive to run. And in particular, because they work in a competitive environment, right? They're always rivals. A kind of structured rivalry is what makes for a modern party system. They need resources, and the number of resources they need, the amount of money they need, depends in part on how much the competition has, and there can be an escalatory logic to that. If the labor movement organizes, if unions start collecting dues, if they give some of that money to Democratic candidates, then wealthy individuals or corporations are going to have to give more to the party that is on their side, right? And you get this kind of arms race of spending, which puts those who have the capacity to fund political parties in a position of real power to set the political agenda, including taking things off the political agenda that might be favored by a large majority of citizens who lack the wealth to fund the parties or candidates who set the political agenda. And so we started the class with Rousseau and Weber and Michels and Schumpeter and a great deal of skepticism about political parties. And what I think we've seen from the history of the Republican Party is that it may be possible at critical political junctures for political parties to operate more in the way that someone like Madison might have hoped they would operate, or that the theorists who we're going to get to in the coming weeks who defend political parties hope they would operate. But mainly, those are vanishingly small moments. And as the new political party gets routinized, as it becomes no longer an insurgent upstart party, it is much more difficult for it to remain a genuine common good party. And in that sense, I guess I am suggesting that American history does bear out some of Weber's and Michel's and Rousseau's concerns. All right, so with that under our belts, obviously we have to turn for a minute at least to the other major political party in the United States, the Democratic Party. And here I want to focus on the Democratic Party primarily from 1877 to 1965. And the reason is that this is the period in which the South is solidly Democratic, right? Following the Tilden-Hayes Compromise of 1877, right, the withdrawal of Northern troops, the erection of a new form of white supremacy in the South, the exclusion of African Americans from voting, their disenfranchisement. This then continues for the better part of a century, including the period from 1930 to the late 1960s, that period of democratic dominance, right? And I'm going to point out, and that this is, I think, extremely important, that in many respects the Democratic Party was really two parties in this period. It was, on the one hand, the Southern Dixiecratic Party. And I quoted to you at the beginning of this class, right, the famous quote from VOK saying that the Democratic Party was in many respects the instrument by which the South conducted its foreign policy with the rest of the country. And the South, in a sense, needed a foreign policy because they had been forcefully reunified with the rest of the country via the Civil War, and because they demanded, as a condition for their ongoing political cooperation with the rest of the country, the maintenance of a system of racial subordination that many in the rest of the country found to be objectionable. And it was by controlling the Southern Democratic Party that the Southern white supremacist regime was maintained for nearly a century. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, but let's remember back to, just for a minute, the work that we looked at on European conservative parties, Daniel Ziblatt's conservative parties and the birth of democracy, and his claim that weak conservative parties often tried to do things like fraud, what he called engage in anti-competitive strategies. And this is certainly the case of the Democratic Party in the South. Just to conclude the overview here for a moment, I think the essential thing to remember is that the Democratic Party of the North and the Midwest and the West is actually a rather different creature than the Democratic Party of the South. That's probably an understatement. It is, in many ways, a workers' party, an immigrant party, a farmers' party. It channels some of the more progressive tendencies in American politics, especially, obviously, once Franklin Delano Roosevelt assumes the leadership, identifies the New Deal, transforms American law, the federal government, the economy as a whole in a much more egalitarian and labor-friendly direction. And I just want to point out to you that the Democratic Party could not have done that without the support of the Dixiecrats, right? That is to say that the way in which the Democratic Party forged a coalition that eventually became a majority coalition and gave it partisan dominance in the middle of the 20th century was precisely by allying itself with the Dixiecrats. It's an unstable, almost a self-contradictory alliance, but it works to give the Democrats the power to legislate and pass truly transformative legislation. And it's not just that they need the Southern Democrats to constitute a majority in Congress, but precisely because the South is a one-party authoritarian state throughout this period. And we'll get into the ways in which, right, Republicans were attacked almost as viciously, and I guess I should modify that to say white Republicans were attacked almost as viciously as African Americans were in the South. The result of this is not only that the South was solidly Democratic, but that the Southern members of Congress served for a very long time. And so they retained their power within Congress. They were committee chairs. They were agenda setters. They had the highest seniority. And so you couldn't get work done without them. And if they were on your side, you could get a lot of work done, right? And this will influence the entire direction of the New Deal in ways that I'll get to in a moment. But I think it's worthwhile noting, right, that this is a two-way street, right? Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a New York Democrat, is able to pass the New Deal transformative legislation because the Southern Democrats support him. And on the other hand, FDR gives the Southern Democrats, the Dixiecrats, what they want, which is the guarantee that nothing in the New Deal will upset the racial hierarchy of the South. And we'll get into the implications of that, but just note that that is the Faustian bargain that the Democrats make in the entire 90-year period under consideration here, until slowly the white Democrats begin to migrate to the Republican Party in the 1970s and especially in the 1980s. So I'm going to focus on the Southern Democrats here for a minute and the history of voter suppression in the Jim Crow South. And these are issues I've spoken with you a little bit about before. I'll refresh your memory that I'm primarily drawing on the work of Carol Anderson, who's a professor at Emory University, very influential, very interesting public intellectual, the author of the book White Rage, which has gotten a lot of attention as one of the essential readings of the Black Life Matters movement, or Black Lives Matter, sorry. And on the other hand, her book, One Person, No Vote, published more recently, is an account of the history of voter suppression and then the current efforts, especially with the gutting of the Voting Rights Act as a result of a Supreme Court decision almost a decade ago now. And so drawing on her work and the work of other scholars, I would point out that the way in which the Southern Democrats maintained their power was similar to the way in which fragile conservative parties maintained or sought to maintain their power in the history of European democracy, and that is with anti-competitive measures, measures that essentially made voting and elections not meaningful contests with a equally empowered opposing party. And they did this through a number of measures that were designed to suppress the vote of African Americans as well as of registered Republicans and registered white Republicans. And so literacy restrictions. And this is famously the case that, right, part of the reason that the educational system in the South was not only segregated, but so incredibly unequal was precisely to deprive African Americans of the level of education necessary to be able to pass the literacy test. I'm sorry, pause for just a moment, because there is somebody at my door and I think I'm the only one. Okay, so I was pointing out that unequal access to education in the South meant that the enforcement of literacy restrictions made it very difficult for African Americans to vote. But I think it's also worthwhile noting that these restrictions were certainly not evenly enforced, right? The classic example of a white person being asked to spell dog or cat, an African American being asked to spell chrysanthemum, and also when you read the historical accounts, it's the case that these not only were these unfairly administered, they were administered in incredibly unequal and differential ways, where white Americans would be able to go to the office, not wait in line, get their test taken, get their voter registration very easily. African Americans, in many ways, found the window would close as soon as they'd walk up to it. They would be ignored, etc. Right, and so it's not just that the tests were uneven and unfair in their content, they were administered in a way to keep African Americans from voting. Similarly, understanding restrictions, and I won't go into the details again, but you had to be able to demonstrate that you understood the Constitution of the state in order to vote in the state. And the Southern constitutions, many of them were deliberately written to be opaque, baroque, very hard to understand, and white Democrats were given the easiest section to explain if they were tested really at all, and African Americans were asked to explain the most difficult portions. Poll tax restrictions, and again, right, the idea that you had to pay a tax in order to be able to vote, and that it wasn't just you had to pay that year's tax, you had to be able to demonstrate that you had paid all of the previous years. And again, there was just outright fraud, cheating, in order to make sure that most African Americans, if they could clear the first two hurdles, were not going to clear the third. Registration restrictions, and I think some of what we're seeing with polling stations closing in minority areas in Republican-controlled states right now, echoes the kind of stuff that occurred in the Jim Crow period in the South, where basically you had to register a certain number of days in advance of the election, and often there was not a registration station anywhere near you. If you tried to go in, again, the window would close. Sometimes the police would be called, and there was obvious intimidation being used to keep African Americans from registering. If all of this failed, if somehow African Americans managed to clear these hurdles, it was very often the case that either the sheriff or the Ku Klux Klan would visit them, that they would be intimidated or lynched, or something in between, houses set on fire, crosses burned on the lawn. This was all done in a campaign to keep African Americans from voting. That is what produced the stranglehold of one party democratic rule in the South. This was common knowledge to Northern Democrats. Northern, Western, Midwestern Democrats made their peace with this for 90 years, despite their principles. And by the way, let's remember, right, that there's a long history of Northern and Western racism as well. And it may not take quite as violent and virulent a form as Jim Crow, segregationist, vigilante violence racism takes. But many Northern Democrats defined themselves in contrast to African Americans, right? And so did not, throughout much of this period, prioritize, to say the least, the idea that African American voting rights should be important rights, that the party should not, in fact, accommodate Southern racists in their midst. And so this is the history of the Democratic Party for this 90 plus year period. I guess we should really just call it 100 years, from 1865 to 1965. And then something changes. And before we get to that change, I just want to point out very quickly, right, that this shaped New Deal policy. And I've lectured with you on these topics before. I'll just, attempt to refresh your memory briefly. We've talked together about Ira Katz Nelson's account when affirmative action was white, and Richard Rothstein's account of the color of law, and together the way in which the GI Bill, Social Security, Medicare, federal housing, insurance, and mortgage support were all designed by Southern Democrats to exclude African Americans, either explicitly by excluding from Social Security benefits the professions that African Americans predominated in, or implicitly by leaving the administration of the GI Bill, housing support, etc., in the hands of the states, knowing in advance that, especially in the southern states, but in many other places as well, this would be administered in a racist way. And this was the condition of support for the New Deal for Southern Democrats. And please note, their line was very clear. The documentary evidence on this is very clear, and obviously there are other works we could point to as well, which is that Southerners not only wanted to keep African Americans in their decidedly subordinate place, but they wanted absolutely no indication in any legislation that African Americans were full and equal citizens, right? And so it's not just that they didn't want them to benefit from this legislation, they didn't want the symbolic or expressive message of this legislation to be that African Americans were getting anything resembling equal treatment in legislation passed with Democratic support. Right. And just remember, when we think now about 21st century America, and we think about the wealth differential, the stubborn, persistent wealth differential in which white Americans have on average 14, 15, 20 times as much wealth as African Americans, please remember that white wealth is the product of the legislation of the New Deal. This is the middle class promoting legislation that put home ownership, that put higher education, that put steady unionized work in the grasp of so many white Americans, and so many African Americans were excluded from this. And it's just worthwhile noting that the Democratic Party, right, and we'll get into this in not too long, the party that now is the multiracial coalition that seems to be increasingly the party of racial justice, is itself deeply responsible for the injustice that it is seemingly currently incapable of repairing. So having said all of that, I want to point out that in 1964, 1965, Lyndon Baines Johnson sponsors and shepherds through Congress bills that are transformational, right? The Civil Rights Bill of 1964, the Voting Rights Bill of 1965. And that just as Teddy Roosevelt or perhaps Eisenhower rise above the structural constraints that their parties have placed on previous presidents, Johnson, who, please remember, right, filibustered previous civil rights legislation, or alternatively engineered the gutting of it so that it was totally impotent to accomplish any aims when he was in the House, in the Senate, representing Texas in 1964 and 1965, changed his tune completely. And I think if you want to look at one of the most fascinating political lives of the 20th century, Johnson is right up there as being extremely interesting, extremely important. And I'm not going to try to account for his individual transformation on civil rights, voting rights, African American rights issues. I am going to try to point out that just like the way in which exceptional circumstances brought the Republican Party into being, the Dred Scott decision, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the collapse of the Whig Party over internal racial divisions, extreme circumstances brought Johnson and the Democrats to the point of passing civil rights legislation in the middle of the 1960s. What were those circumstances? Well, they include, of course, the civil rights movement, which was at that point in its second decade under the inspired leadership of Martin Luther King Jr., but broadly based and continuously using the still relatively new medium of television as well as the newspapers to bring the violent nature of Southern racial oppression into the living rooms, not only of most Americans throughout the country, but also abroad. And so then the second element of the context here is, of course, the Cold War and the fact that the United States was locked in a heated battle with the Soviet Union for the alliance of countries throughout the world, many of whom, most of whom, had a majority person of color population, right? We were competing in Africa and Latin America and Asia for supremacy vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And if the Soviet Union could claim that the United States was a racist society, that their constitution might proclaim equal rights for all, but in practice, what this really meant was white supremacy. And all you got to do is turn on your TV and you can see the evidence of water cannons being shot at children, dogs being used to oppress peaceful protesters. Then it was going to make life very difficult for Johnson and the United States and the Cold Warriors in charge of our foreign policy. And so the domestic protests combined with the international context, combined, by the way, with the fact that a large number of African Americans had served with distinction in World War II, Korea, and were serving in Vietnam and came home with a sense, on the one hand, of empowerment, and on the other hand, of having sacrificed for their country and therefore deserving the same rights as any other citizen. All of this, I think, made it irresistible for Johnson. And you may remember famously that when Martin Luther King Jr. met with President Johnson after the passing of the Civil Rights Act and said, now we need to get voting rights done, Johnson said to King, make me do it, right? He wasn't willing to take the initiative absent external pressure. That external pressure, both within the country and outside of it, made it possible for Johnson to lead the Democratic Party to really change its relationship to the Dixiecrats in the 1960s. I'll say one more thing about this, and I just think this is worthwhile noting. If you look at the votes in Congress for the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts, it is actually the case that proportionately more Republicans voted for them than Democrats did, which is to say they got roughly 2/3 support from Republicans and right about 50% support from Democrats. Together, that was enough to pass this legislation, right? But it was widely perceived to be Democratic legislation, despite the fact that the Republicans actually gave it more support proportionately than the Democrats did, because, of course, there were many more many more Democrats in Congress at that point. Democrats controlled the committee chairs, controlled the ultimate majorities in both chambers, and there was a Democratic president as well. And so ultimately, this is appropriately credited to the Democrats, even though Republicans strongly supported it. And the result was exactly as Johnson predicted, actually worse than he predicted. He predicted that the Democrats would lose the South for a generation. I don't know how you count your generations, but we're at least 2 or 3 generations past those acts. And it is still the case that the Republicans have a clear strategic advantage in the South, even if it's not as strong as it was 20 or 30 years ago, as we see in, for instance, Georgia today. It's worthwhile noting that even after the Voting Rights Act was passed, there were repeated efforts to circumvent it. And then, of course, Shelby v. Holder gutted it in 2013. And I won't go into the current efforts, but I want to conclude by drawing a lesson, because what we see is, right, that the white former Dixiecrats of the South, white people whose political and social identity seems to be strongly connected to living in a majority white state in which white people are privileged, in which African Americans are minimally deferential and subordinate, they shifted to the Republican Party. But to put it that way is, I think, to be too passive about it. We know that Richard Nixon, looking at what Barry Goldwater had done, identified a Southern strategy, used the language of law and order as racially coded language to bring the Dixiecrats into the Republican camp. And that since then, in a gradual, incremental process, the Republican Party has done more and more to dog whistle, to use coded language to make it clear that they are on the side of Southern whites and that they are anti-immigration, that they are mainly not in favor of continuing the agenda of civil rights. Obviously, critical race theory has become this tennis ball in contemporary politics, something we're hitting back and forth as another symbolic way to fight against any effort to extend full equal rights to African Americans. And here's the depressing conclusion I want us to consider from this portion of the history. And the question is whether the white racist vote in the United States, whether we're talking about 1877 or 2016 or 2021, is simply too tempting a prize for both parties to simultaneously resist. If both parties are driven via competitive dynamics to want to maximize their vote, if it is a viable strategy to maximize your vote by catering to those who oppose racial justice, who want to see the continuation of racial subordination, will one or the other party always be lured by the desire to capture those persons' votes to oppose racial justice. And so will one party always be supremacist and suppressive, right? And here I'm putting those two together, be about maintaining racial hierarchy, and therefore, especially in light of the demographics of the United States today, be in favor of measures that prevent non-white people from fully exercising their proportionate share of power via the vote. And again, right, this is, it seems to me, another way of thinking through the very general, I think, frankly, overly generalized claims of people like Weber and Michels that political parties are inherently oligarchic. Political parties are inherently competitive. They want power. But that often means, as opposed to, right, the two-way valve that I spoke about, that Madison seemed to have in mind, in which the party elite would be sufficiently high-minded, patriotic, interested in the overall good of the country and in justice, as opposed to that, often those who assume positions of power in political parties are willing to cater to the worst tendencies of the population or significant segments of it if it delivers them partisan advantage. We have to seriously consider that possibility. Now, this is the end of the historical portion of the lecture. I will just point out what I should have pointed to this already. I think it was Flossie who pointed to the anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre, the 100th anniversary that we noted last month. And this is an indication of the kind of vigilante violence that was used to maintain racial subordination, right? This is a picture of Black Wall Street burning in 1921, right? And I'm not going to go into, I'm not prepared to go into a whole lecture on that topic, but it's just a good illustration of the way in which the kinds of policies pursued by Dixiecrats, tolerated within the Democratic Party as a whole, manifested themselves in deep racism and violence throughout the 100-year period. The Democrats were a one-party authoritarian state in the South. I'm going to stop for a minute because I'm now at that transition point where I want to take us into the contemporary period. But before I do that, I want to ask if you have any questions about the historical material I've just shared with you. Any thoughts? And obviously, I guess I'm an equal opportunity offender. I've told stories about both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, where both parties have some things to be proud of, but much to be ashamed of. And my lessons from this suggest that we may need to chasten our hopes for political parties, that in the competitive dynamics in which they operate, given their dependence on funding, given the unequal distribution of wealth in a market society, they may not be agents for good on a reliable basis. Anybody want to ask a question at this point, or do you want me to move into the present?
I want to thank you, David, for pointing out the role of the Cold War in shaping all of this, and as a major force. And we ought to keep thinking about how we could make it work for us again in some way.
Yeah, so I don't know about the Cold War, but what about climate change? What about the pandemic? What about poverty and how it distorts our society, right? You know, some sense of a common enemy, right, common cause, to put it somewhat more positively, seems to be essential for people coming together. It's funny, I'm not yet into it. I've got this big stack of great books I want to read. One of them is the new book by Robert Putnam, The Upswing. And he suggests that we might just be in a period where the crises that we face, whether it's growing inequality, lack of unemployment, or climate change, might be enough to bring us together again in a way parallel to what the Cold War did. Now, having said all of that, it's actually right. The negative pressure of the Cold War, in part, that forces Johnson and before him the Kennedys to say, wait, we got to keep these Southerners out of at least the headlines and the nightly news. Elizabeth?
Yes, I want to say there were rumblings in the 50s. I grew up in a high school class of 56 in suburban Baltimore. This was a suburb that was kind of mixed middle and upper class. And anytime there was a dance, the band was black, but it always closed with Dixie. However, there was sort of one neighborhood church that most of us went to, and it was very civil rights oriented. And volunteers went to downtown Baltimore. Then when I went to college in Boston, it was even stronger. It was very civil rights. I went downtown to a church and tutored kids. I marched in a civil rights march. I even joined the NAACP for a while. Now, by current standards, this is all pretty pathetic. But then it was a big deal. And then Johnson eventually signed these things after Selma, and then it seemed to sort of fizzle.
Elizabeth, I just want to ask a follow-up question. First of all, I don't think it's pathetic. I mean, I think you always judge what you're doing by the moment in which you're doing it. And it sounds to me like it was, frankly, courageous when you were doing it. But in what you said, I did not hear you mention a party. I heard you mention churches and schools.
Yes, that was where it happened.
Yeah, and that's, I think, worthwhile noting, right? And of course, churches are integral to the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement is a social movement. And I think one of the things let me just amplify the point I made a few minutes ago, which is it's the Cold War and it's the civil rights movement, right? And the two, the fact that the two come together at that particular historical moment is what makes it perhaps irresistible for Johnson to finally do something to protect civil and voting rights, right? And having said that, right, the social movement is not a party movement, right? It's explicitly a alternative to the Democratic or the Republican Party, right? And the Republican Party in the 50s is probably more strongly civil rights than the Democratic Party for the most part. But neither one of them is really taking up the banner until an independent social movement forces them to part by leveraging the necessities of Cold War competition to generate some leverage, right? All right, Elizabeth, thank you. I don't want us to lose focus of the fact that in a sense, the Democratic Party, when it eventually became the Party of Civil Rights, was acting under extreme pressure. It wasn't simply a change of heart on the part of Johnson or something like that.
Yeah, well, both Maryland Maryland was sort of Dixiecrat, I guess. Massachusetts was Democratic. Both were Democratic places.
Yeah, it's funny because my graduate school mentor, John Rawls, is from Baltimore. And I remember speaking with him about how Southern Baltimore felt to him growing up. And he grew up in the first decades of the 20th century, but that it really felt like a Southern city, and that many people didn't think of Maryland as being Southern, but that Baltimore really had the feel of a Southern city when he was growing up. All right, anybody else with the question about the historical stuff?
Me,
Go
Flossie.
ahead, Flossie.
Yeah.
I am noticing that MSNBC, which during the beginnings of the possibility that we might have a Black president, had largely commentators who were white, liberal commentators. Now what is happening is that MSNBC, which is still largely white, is becoming increasingly accepting of a new kind of commentator. And it is surprising how little by little MSNBC is changing its color.
And I guess
Yes.
go ahead, Flossie.
Well, it may, in certain circles, be too much for some liberals. It may be scary. And that's part of the heritage that we have.
Yeah.
I just wanted to call that to your attention.
No, well,
And it isn't literary, you see.
But let me just add.
Yeah.
NPR, PBS,
Yes.
the BBC,
Yeah.
right? There's a whole controversy around Nicole Hannah-Jones of the New York Times right now, right? And so, yes, there is a deliberate effort to diversify the press, at least the center left and further left than that. There's this controversy around, I'm going to bungle it, but the Foreign Film Critics Guild, what's that called? Right, and the fact that they're essentially all white, and they administer a awards program every year. Probably somebody can do a better job at this than I can, but that they are losing their legitimacy by being an all-white journalistic organization. And so I think we're going to see probably increasing polarization in the media environment. And part of what I'm going to get to, I think now next week, is the idea that our media has become the tribal drum beaters for our partisan rivalry, and race has become extremely important to the way in which we're being polarized in our politics. Bob, go ahead, and thank you for the good comment, Flossie.
I just want to note that in many areas, races or integration is going forward much faster than I would have thought. In particular, advertising. You see so many Blacks portrayed in advertising, and mixed race families. And maybe it's the television that I watch, because I tend to watch British shows. They have lots of people of color, lots of mixed race, et cetera, and I'm just struck by that. And it to me is the way that this stuff is going to become accepted, because people are watching all this, not even thinking that it's going to improve the racial environment.
Let us hope you're right, Bob. And I'm going to be a little bit more cynical about this in two respects. I mean, the first is, if we're talking about advertising, but we can talk about actual content as well. But there's a reason, right, that we're seeing interracial couples in advertisements for everything from soap to diamond rings. And that is because they think that this is going to sell to their targeted demographic, right? And so then we got to ask what their targeted demographic is. And if the second thing I want to say is right, which is that as hopeful as this is for those of us who want a less racially hierarchical, a more genuinely multiracial future for this country and for humanity, it's also frightening, challenging, upsetting for a number of other people. And so some of us may be edified or encouraged by this, and others are being provoked by it. And just as, in a sense, 8 years of Obama brought us 4 years of Trump, a kind of, reaction of resentment against the empowering of an African-American president. I do think, what we're seeing right now with, and I don't watch a lot of it, but Fox News beating the drum on critical race theory, right, et cetera, is in a sense of pushback against this, because again, you've got to ask, who does it sell to? There are a lot of people out there who see this and are frightened by it, upset about it, resentful against it. And so just remember that sitting in Northern California, you may have one reaction, but there are other parts of the country, other demographics, other strata who have different reactions as well.
Well, thank you for the cold shower.
Yeah, you want to see something interesting? Well, actually, William has his hand up. Where are you, William? There you are. Go ahead.
Bill Guinan, a few minutes ago, you were saying the country could perhaps unify around climate change and COVID, but most of the people who are for voter suppression are also against climate change and against COVID, at least the COVID vaccine.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I was referring to the argument of Robert Putnam's The Upswing, and it's more complicated than just we've got common causes and therefore we can come together. I think the argument here is a bit of a self-reinforcing dynamic in which, if we do things that succeed in meeting these challenges, so let's say the infrastructure bill passes, right? It has some bipartisan support, but there are a lot of conditions. Let's say there's money in it for building 500,000 electrical vehicle charging stations, and that the result is that hundreds of thousands of American workers get new jobs. And let's say that then you start building a constituency in those portions of the population that have come to treat climate change as a wedge or culture war issue. I'm not for environmental policies because the kind of people who are for environmental policies have screwed me and gotten rich by screwing me, right? To just be simplistic about it for a moment. And all of a sudden, some of those people start getting jobs in industries related to combating climate change. There's a possibility that could change some interests and maybe as a result change some minds. So that yes, it would involve breaking the self-reinforcing polarizing cycle we're in right now. And I have to say that the next book I'm going to speak with you about is not Bob Putnam's relatively optimistic book. It's Ezra Klein's Why We're Polarized, which is a quite pessimistic book. I'm not convinced by Putnam. I like being able to point in the direction of something more hopeful, but that doesn't mean that it's a cakewalk from here to less polarized policies, even if the infrastructure bill ultimately passes and we start spending billions of dollars doing some stuff to combat climate change. And some people come to see combating climate change as being job creating as opposed to job killing. That's all important. But ultimately, if the Republican Party continues to tell its members this is all an elite conspiracy to take away your jobs and your cars, we're going to have a hard time making headway on this. So yeah, William, you're absolutely right that these issues that could be unifying issues could also equally be polarizing issues.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. On the issue of race, I'm going to share one thing with you that I'll be talking with you more about next week, but I just can't resist previewing for a moment. So like I say, I'm going to be talking with you about Ezra Klein and the extent and nature of American polarization. Look at this diagram here for just a minute, just to preview where we're going. And this has to do, right, with what Ezra Klein calls the diversity divergence, the percentage of non-white voters in the two parties. And as you can see, it was very low in the 1950s and not that different for the Democrats and the Republicans. Since that civil rights movement, right, things have been going in opposite directions, with the Democratic Party at this point being almost majority minority, the Republican Party still only having around 10% support from minorities, which means that 90% of its support comes from white voters. If you want to see in a nutshell why it's so hard to view race as anything but a polarizing issue, I think that's a good example. John, you want to ask the last question for today? Go ahead.
Well, I just noticed in the New York Times this morning, there's an article about the implications of the mayoral election in New York, which is not quite finished because of ranked voting, but Eric Adams is apparently going to win this election, and he won it on the basis of the most conservative and pro-police platform in the Democratic Party, and he won it almost entirely on Black and brown votes from the Bronx and Brooklyn.
Yeah.
And the point of the article is that counting on African Americans to continue to support the Democrats and particularly Latinos may be a dangerous tack for the Democrats to take, for the progressive wing of the Democrats to take.
Yeah, and I would just point out to you very quickly as somebody here, right? I don't disagree with anything of that, and I've seen this analysis both in the Times and other places. And Adams is among the more conservative people in this field. He's still pretty left, pretty democratic, looked at from a national perspective. Yes, he did make fighting crime and continuing to fund the police central to his campaign, but he's also talking an awful lot about inequality and workers' rights and unionization, right? And so I think we might be a little bit over our tips of our skis to say, the Democrats are in trouble because Adams won the mayoral campaign with primarily Black and Latino support. Yes, it's not a win for a Democratic Socialist or the left wing of the Democratic Party. Yes, he's probably not as progressive on issues as the current white mayor de Blasio is. But let's notice that de Blasio, has rather mixed and lukewarm reviews from progressive Democrats, despite having run as a progressive Democrat, right? So all that to say, I'm not ready yet to say that the Democratic Party won't continue to move in a progressive direction because Latinos or African Americans are not as progressive as white liberals. There's some truth to that, but they don't really have, it seems to me, much of a home in the Republican Party right now. And in a two-party system, it's not just about what the one party is doing, but also what the other choice on the menu is, right?
Well, the action is mostly in primaries these days in the United States.
Of course, of course.
Yeah.
And on that note, these days in the United States will be our primary focus for next week's lecture. Take care, everyone. Good
Thank
luck with the heat, and have good weeks. I will see you next Saturday. Bye, guys. Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Bye, guys.